Discrimination is something that comes up quite regularly when I'm advising my clients. I've recorded a series of 3 short videos looking at discrimination. In part 1, I shall be looking at what discrimination is, and we'll be going through the different types of discrimination. Any information that I give in this video is of a general nature. Discrimination in particular can be quite complex, so employers should always seek specific legal advice about the issue that they are dealing with. And there'll be information at the end of this video about how to contact me. So a question that I've heard many times over is, I have never really understood the difference between direct and indirect discrimination. How do I know if I am discriminating against somebody? So let's first of all define what we mean by discrimination. So discrimination is covered under the Equality Act 2010. And it states in the Equality Act that it is unlawful to discriminate, harass or victimize someone because they have or are perceived to have a protected characteristic or are associated with someone who has a protected characteristic. The protected characteristics, as you can see here, are sex or gender, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, age, disability, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion, and philosophical belief. You may be more familiar with some of these than others, and you may have had to deal with cases of perhaps sex discrimination or age discrimination, and may be less familiar with those such as marriage and civil partnership. But it's important that you do understand what some of these are, so do look into those further. But in the meantime, let's have a look at the different types of discrimination. So under the Equality Act, the types of discrimination are direct, indirect, discrimination by perception, discrimination by association, and harassment and victimization. And we're going to go into each of those in a little bit more detail now. So first of all, direct discrimination. This is when someone is treated unfairly because of a protected characteristic such as age or sex. An example of that might be that someone is not offered a job because they are considered to be too old. That would be direct age discrimination. Indirect discrimination can happen when there is a provision, criteria, or practice that applies to a group of individuals, but in practice are less fair to those that share the same protected characteristic. So let's have a look at an example of what we mean by that. So an example might be that the employer is planning to recruit a young person, which excludes all older workers. If that's the case, that would be indirect age discrimination. So putting those 2 examples together, if we looked at that in the context of a claim, the older applicant was directly discriminated against because he or she was considered too old for the job. They were told they couldn't have the job, and that was directed at them personally. So direct discrimination. In addition, when thinking about that unfair treatment, the candidate looked at the different reasons given to them, and it came to light that maybe in their defense, they had no intention of employing an older worker and they were planning on bringing in a younger person. That would be indirect discrimination, of course. So this applicant could potentially bring a claim for both direct and indirect age discrimination. And it's worth noting that compensation amounts for discrimination claims are not capped, which means it could be tens of thousands of pounds in compensation, depending on their losses and injury to feelings. It could run into hundreds of thousands or even millions if there is a particularly bad case of unfair treatment. And there are plenty of cases that have demonstrated that in practice. Looking at perception and association, these would most likely be claims of direct discrimination. And these examples include, for perception, a person might be taunted because they are perceived to be gay, for example, but actually they're not gay. So they haven't got that protected characteristic, they're perceived to have it. But the harm that they experience by that taunting or the behaviour against them is as damaging as if they had the protected characteristic themselves. Discrimination by association, an example is where the person perhaps might be the main carer of a disabled child, or maybe an elderly relative who's disabled and requiring care. And it is anticipated that it will have an effect on their ability to commit to doing their job. So they miss out on an opportunity due to the association with that person that they care for. Harassment and victimisation. Now, this is slightly different to bullying and harassment that you may have come across in the past. This directly relates to the Equality Act and the protected characteristics. So in order for a claim to be brought in the Employment Tribunal for harassment and victimisation in terms of discrimination, it would need to be in relation to protected characteristics. So examples here for harassment is where unwanted conduct on the grounds of a protected characteristic such as age takes place with the purpose or effect of violating the person's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. And to a very large extent, it is down to the victim, if you like, to determine what that environment felt like, not necessarily the harasser. They may not have intended to create that hostile, degrading, humiliating environment, but in effect, they did. Victimization is where a person is treated less favorably than other persons would be treated because he or she, for example, raised a grievance concerning discrimination or brought proceedings in the Employment Tribunal, or may have given evidence in such a case if it involves somebody else. And that is where they are then treated less favourably because they brought that grievance or because they brought that claim. Again, it would need to be in relation to a discrimination claim for that to be successful. So that brings us to the end of part 1. In part 2, I've got 2 further short videos. In part 2, we're going to be looking at what disability discrimination is specifically, because that is actually even more complex than normal cases of discrimination. And in that video, I'll cover what amounts to a disability, substantial and long-term effects, and the duty to consider reasonable adjustments. In part 3, I'll be looking at how to defend a discrimination claim, or when it might be lawful to discriminate, such as a genuine occupational qualification. And we'll be maybe looking at things like proportionality and legitimate aims, etc. So if you have discrimination going on in your business, or complaints of discrimination, or you're concerned about discrimination, or simply want to find out more, then you may contact me on hello@contracthrm.co.uk email address, or via the Facebook page, or via the web page. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you for watching.